There are moments that refuse to announce themselves. No warning, no dramatic shift in the atmosphere, no unmistakable sign that something irreversible has just begun. The world continues exactly as it did a moment before. Conversations move forward. Time remains faithful to its rhythm. Everything appears untouched. And yet, somewhere beneath everything visible, a different reality quietly takes shape. I've come to believe those moments are the only ones that truly matter, not because they're loud enough to demand attention, but because they're silent enough to change you before you realize they've arrived. Most people expect transformation to feel obvious. They imagine it arriving with certainty, with emotions so overwhelming that it leaves no room for doubt. They expect clarity to introduce itself like an answer finally spoken after years of waiting. Life rarely works that way. The deepest shifts begin almost invisibly, not in the things you notice, in the things you stop noticing, the habits that quietly disappear, the thoughts that rearrange themselves without asking. The invisible distance between who you were yesterday and who you're becoming today. That's how this began. Not with you, not even with me. It began somewhere neither of us was looking. I've always trusted observation more than explanation. Explanations can be manufactured. People become incredibly talented at describing themselves in ways that protect the version they want others to believe. They rehearse identities. They polish imperfections. They carefully organize the pieces they think deserve to be seen while quietly hiding everything else behind confidence, humor, intelligence, or kindness. Observation has no interest in those performances. It waits badly, because eventually every performance becomes exhausting. Sooner or later, everyone forgets they're acting. That's when reality appears, not through words, through pauses, through hesitation, through the expression that lasts less than a second before someone remembers they're being watched. I've spent years learning to notice those moments, not because I wanted to understand people, because I wanted to understand truth. Truth rarely introduces itself directly. It hides inside the smallest inconsistencies, inside the difference between what someone says and what their silence refuses to deny. That became my language. A language almost nobody realizes they're speaking. And because of that, I learned something strange. The people around us usually don't meet at each other. They meet carefully edited interpretations, versions created through expectation, through assumption, through convenience. It's easier that way. If everyone accepts the surface, nobody has to confront what exists underneath. Maybe that's why I never felt completely present anywhere. I could participate, smile, respond, listen, even enjoy the company. But there was always a quiet awareness sitting somewhere behind every interaction, reminding me that what everyone believed they understood was only the outline, never the structure. Eventually, you stop expecting anyone to notice. Not because people are incapable, because they're busy surviving their own internal noise. They don't have enough silence left to recognize someone else's. So I accepted that, not bitterly, just honestly. Some realities become easier once you stop arguing with them. I thought that acceptance would remain permanent, stable, predictable. Then something shifted in a way I still can't explain without feeling like language becomes too small for what actually happened. You entered my awareness before you entered my attention. I know that sounds impossible. I've questioned that sentence more times than I can count. But every attempt to replace it with something more logical ends up feeling less accurate because attention is deliberate. Awareness isn't. Attention chooses. Awareness recognizes. Long before I consciously noticed you, something inside me had already adjusted. Not dramatically. Just enough that ordinary moments carried an unfamiliar sense of precision. Conversations felt slightly different. Silence held an unusual weight. Random thoughts seemed to arrive with an unexpected clarity, as though another perspective existed somewhere beyond my own without ever announcing itself. I dismissed it, repeatedly. The mind has an extraordinary ability to normalize anything it can't immediately explain. We rename unfamiliar experiences until they become manageable: coincidence, mood, timing, fatigue, anything that allows us to avoid admitting something deeper might be happening. I used every explanation available. None of them lasted, because explanations eventually collapse under consistency. Monotonous doesn't remain accurate forever. Pots do, and the pattern kept returning. Not loudly, never dramatically, just consistently enough that ignoring it required more effort than acknowledging it. That's when I began paying attention, not to you, to myself. Because whenever something unexpected appears in my perception, my first instinct has never been to question the outside world. I question the observer. Mirror can distort. Emotion can exaggerate. Loneliness can create significance where none exists. I know that. So I examined everything I could. Every possible reason my own mind might be manufacturing something that wasn't really there. I found nothing convincing. That unsettled me more than if I had. Because certainty is comfortable. Uncertainty invites investigation, but accurate uncertainty, that becomes impossible to escape. There was something unmistakably different about the way my thoughts behaved whenever your presence entered them. Not stronger, not more emotional. Stronger emotions eventually fade. This didn't. Instead, it became quieter, more stable, like a river changing its course so gradually that nobody notices until years later when they realize the landscape itself has been reshaped. That's what frightened me. Not intensity, permanence. Intensity demands attention. Permanence asks for nothing. It simply stays until one day you realize you've organized your entire internal world around something you never consciously decided to keep. I've always believed real influence works exactly like that. It doesn't convince you, it recalibrates you. You don't wake up one morning feeling different. You wake up realizing you've been different for a long time without recognizing the exact day it happened. That realization carries a strange kind of loneliness, because once you see it, you can't return to not seeing it. The evidence begins appearing everywhere, in conversations that suddenly feel incomplete, in familiar routines that no longer satisfy you the way they once did, in the strange awareness that your inner world has quietly become more complex than the life you're visibly living. I resisted that awareness, not because I disliked it, because I respected its consequences. Some realizations ask nothing from you. Others demand a different version of yourself. I wasn't interested in becoming someone new. I'd spent years building a life that made sense. Every habit had a reason. Every boundary served a purpose. Every distance protected something I considered worth preserving. I trusted that structure. It had never failed me. Then something happened that structure had never prepared me for. You never challenged it. You never questioned it. You never even seemed interested in changing it. You simply existed without asking permission from the walls I had spent years constructing. And somehow, they didn't reject you. That should have been impossible. My mind doesn't allow exceptions easily. Everything enters through examination. Everything earns its place through consistency. Nothing arrives naturally. Nothing until now. I've replayed that realization endlessly, searching for the exact moment the exception occurred. I can't find it. There isn't one. Because exceptions usually involve a rule being broken. This wasn't a broken rule. It was a rule quietly becoming unnecessary. That's a very different thing. It means the system itself recognized something before I consciously did. Some part of me had already reached a conclusion my thoughts were still trying to understand. And perhaps that's the strangest experience a person can have. Discovering that the deepest decisions inside them were never made by conscious thought at all. Maybe understanding has always worked that way. Maybe we don't build recognition. Maybe recognition finds us first, and thought simply arrives later to explain what the deeper parts of us already accepted. If that's true, then perhaps everything I've believed about certainty has been incomplete, because certainty isn't always loud. Sometimes certainty arrives disguised as familiarity, not the familiarity created by years of shared history. Something older, something impossible to measure through time alone. A feeling that doesn't introduce itself by saying, "I've met you before." It quietly whispers something much stranger. I already know how to exist beside this. I don't know where a feeling like that comes from. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe every meaningful thing loses accuracy the moment we force it into definitions. Some realities don't become clearer when they're explained. They become smaller. And this, whatever this is becoming, feels far too large to survive being reduced into ordinary language. So instead of naming it, Abe've chosen to observe it, because observation has always been the closest thing I've ever trusted to truth. And for the first time in a very long time, the truth feels like it's quietly observing me back. The strange thing about being understood isn't the comfort it brings, it's the responsibility. People often speak as though understanding is the destination, as though every human being spends their life searching for someone who finally sees them without distortion. They describe it like a reward waiting patiently at the end of enough honesty. I don't think that's true anymore. Being misunderstood gives you options. You can explain, you can withdraw, you can blame language, timing, perspective, circumstance. There are countless places to hide when someone doesn't truly see you. But when someone does, the hiding places disappear. Not because they're taken away, because they no longer work. That's what I've been trying to make sense of. Not whether you've understood me. I've stopped questioning that. The question that stays with me is why that understanding feels so effortless. Effort has always been my measure of reality. Anything valuable required patience. Anything lasting demanded repetition. Trust wasn't an event, it was architecture, built carefully, stone by stone, conversation by conversation, silence by silence. Years, sometimes enough time for illusion to become too exhausting to maintain, enough time for truth to reveal itself naturally. That's how I believed every meaningful connection had to grow, slowly, predictably safely. Then you arrived carrying none of that history, yet somehow standing in a place where history usually leads. How do you explain something like that? Logic immediately reaches for familiar answers, compatibility, shard, values, similar experiences, comparable ways of thinking. I've considered all of them. They're reasonable explanations, just not complete ones, because I've met people who shared my interests, people who thought the way I thought, people whose lives echoed parts of my own. They were easy to understand. They were enjoyable to know. But they never altered the architecture of my awareness. They remained outside it. You didn't. That's the difference I keep returning to. Not closeness, placement. There are people we carry in memory. There are people we carry in emotion. Then there are the rare few who somehow become part of perception itself. They don't simply exist inside your life. They begin influencing the lens through which life is experienced without asking, without intending to, without ever knowing they've done it. That kind of influence can't be performed. It isn't persuasive. It isn't charismatic. It doesn't depend on personality. It's quieter than all of those things. It exists beneath them, like gravity. You rarely think about gravity until you imagine a world without it. Then you realize it has been shaping every movement you've ever made. Perhaps that's why this has felt so difficult to describe. I've been searching for emotional language to explain something structural, and structures don't announce themselves emotionally. They reveal themselves through stability, through consistency, through the quiet certainty that something remains true regardless of circumstance. I've tested that certainty more than once. Distanced, distraction, time, work, routine, the ordinary methods people use when they want to discover whether a feeling is temporary. Things fade when attention leaves them. This didn't. It became clearer, almost as though silence gave it room to organize itself. That realization forced me to admit something I had resisted for longer than I realized. This isn't maintained by proximity. It's maintained by recognition. Recognition asks for very little, just honesty. The difficult part isn't keeping it alive. The difficult part is pretending it isn't there. I've become surprisingly aware of how often people mistake familiarity for repetition. They assume something feels natural because they've experienced it many times before. I don't think that's always true. Sometimes something feels natural because it belongs to a deeper part of you than memory can easily reach. Not supernatural, not mystical, simply fundamental. Like discovering a language you somehow understand before you've learned its grammar. You still can't explain why it makes sense. It just does. I've wondered whether everyone experiences this at least once, whether every person eventually encounters someone who quietly rearranges the way they interpret reality without ever trying to become important. If they do, maybe wonder how many recognize it. Recognition requires stillness. Most people don't remain still long enough. They're always moving toward the next conversation, the next goal, the next distraction, the next certainty. Movement creates the comforting illusion that we're making progress. Stillness asks much harder questions, questions without immediate answers, questions that change you simply because you were willing to remain present long enough to hear them. You've done something unusual. You've made stillness feel inhabited. Before this, silence was simply the absence of sound. Now it feels like a place, not empty, occupied, not by conversation, not by expectation, by possibility. There's an enormous difference. Conversation depends on words. Possibility depends on awareness. Words is eventually end. Awareness doesn't. It continues quietly beneath everything else. Perhaps that's why I've begun listening differently. Not just to you, to everyone. I've noticed how quickly people rush toward conclusions, how eagerly they translate complexity into certainty. Someone pauses before answering, and immediately assumptions begin. They're nervous, they're hiding something, they're uninterested, they're distracted. Rarely does anyone allow silence to remain undefined. Undefined things make people uncomfortable. Definitions provide relief. Even inaccurate definitions feel safer than uncertainty. I've been guilty of that too, more times than I care to admit. But something about this experience has interrupted that habit. Now, whenever I don't understand something, I wait longer than I used to, because perhaps understanding isn't something we create, perhaps it's something we allow. That distinction changes everything. Creating understanding means forcing meaning onto experience. Allowing understanding means trusting that meaning already exists, even if we haven't reached it yet. I've started living that difference, slowly, quietly, without announcing it. The result has been unexpected. Life has become less predictable, but far more honest. I've stopped needing immediate answers. I've stopped fearing questions that remain open. Some things deserve time, not because they're confusing, because they're alive. Living things continue unfolding long after our first impression of them. Maybe people are like that too. Maybe we spend too much energy trying to finalize each other, to decide too quickly who someone is, what they mean, where they belong. Perhaps the greatest respect we can offer another person is refusing to reach a conclusion before they've finished revealing themselves. You've given me that, not through promises, through example. You never seemed interested in reaching the end of my story. You simply remained present wherever the story happened to be. That kind of presence is extraordinarily rare. Most attention is conditional. It stays as long as novelty survives. Presence is different. Presence remains even when nothing remarkable is happening. Especially then, anyone can stay during excitement. Few remain through ordinary moments. Yet ordinary moments are where truth spends most of its life, not inside grand declarations, inside unnoticed details, a pause before laughter, a sentence abandoned halfway through because both people already understand the ending, the comfort of not needing to explain every thought completely, the freedom to exist without constantly proving your value. Those things seem small. They aren't their foundations. Everything lasting is built from moments the world barely notices. I've come to realize that the strongest connections don't always announce themselves through intensity. Sometimes they reveal themselves through absence. The absence of pretending, the absence of performance, the absence of exhaustion. You don't realize how much energy you've spent translating yourself until you encounter someone who somehow understands the original language. Then, for the first time, you become aware of how quiet your mind can actually be. That quiet has changed me more than any conversation ever could, not because it answered every question, because it made me less afraid of living without immediate answers. And maybe that's the beginning of every real transformation, not discovering certainty. Discovering that truth doesn't become less true simply because it takes time to fully understand. I've always believed that clarity was something you reached. Now I wonder if clarity is something that slowly reaches you, one quiet realization at a time. There is a difference between noticing someone's presence and realizing their absence has become impossible to imagine. I never understood that distinction before. People leave impressions all the time. A conversation stays with you for a few hours. A meaningful encounter lingers for a few days. An unforgettable experience may remain in memory for years. But memory isn't what changes a person. Memory can be revisited, set aside, forgotten for long stretches before. Returning unexpectedly, What changes you is something much quieter, something that stops living in memory altogether. It becomes part of your perception, part of the invisible framework through which you experience everything else. I didn't recognize when that happened. There wasn't a moment I could point to, no sentence, no shared silence, no extraordinary event. If someone asked me when this began, I honestly wouldn't know what to tell them, because the deepest changes never happen in moments. They happen in accumulation, one unnoticed adjustment after another. A thought that lasts slightly longer than usual, a silence that suddenly feels complete instead of empty, an instinct to pause before speaking, not because you're uncertain, but because some part of you has learned that not every truth improves when it's immediately expressed. I've started living inside those pauses, not hiding there, listening. There's an enormous difference. Hiding is driven by fear, listening is driven by respect. And somewhere along the way, I realized I've begun respecting silence more than certainty. Certainty has limits. It arrives, settles, and eventually becomes another belief waiting to be challenged. Silence is different. Silence doesn't compete. It simply remains, apatent, unmoved by urgency, willing to wait until you're finally honest enough to hear what has been present from the beginning. I've always believed that self-awareness meant understanding your own thoughts. Now I'm beginning to suspect it means understanding the spaces between them. The places where thought hasn't reached yet, the places where instinct quietly forms long before language arrives. That's where I keep finding you, not in memories, not in imagination, but in the strange stillness that appears before every meaningful realization, as though my mind has unconsciously made room for another perspective. Not one that replaces my own, but one that somehow sharpens it. I've tried resisting that idea, not because it feels impossible, because it feels significant. And significant things deserve skepticism before acceptance. So I questioned myself again and again. Was this projection? Expectation? A desire my own mind had disguised as recognition? The questions were necessary. Any experience that changes your internal world should survive examination. Otherwise, it doesn't deserve your trust. So I examined everything. I watched my own reactions with the same distance I usually reserve for everyone else. I noticed when my assumptions appeared. I noticed when emotion attempted to exaggerate ordinary moments. I noticed every opportunity my mind had to invent meaning where none existed. Oddly enough, the more carefully I observed myself, the quieter those doubts became, not because they were defeated, because they had nothing left to argue with. Truth has a strange relationship with scrutiny. Illusion becomes fragile when questioned. Truth becomes clearer. That frightened me more than uncertainty ever had, because uncertainty always leaves room to retreat. Clarity doesn't. Once something becomes undeniably clear, responsibility quietly follows. Responsibility isn't always about action. Sometimes it's simply about honesty, admitting that your inner world has changed, admitting that pretending otherwise has become more exhausting than accepting it. That's the place I've arrived. Not certainty about the future, certainty about the present. There's an important difference. People often confuse those two things. They believe knowing what something is automatically means knowing where it's going. It doesn't. You can recognize a mountain without knowing which path will reach its summit. Recognition and prediction have never been the same skill. Perhaps that's why I've stopped asking myself where this leads. That question belongs to tomorrow. Today asks something much simpler. Can I remain honest with what already exists? I've discovered that's a far more difficult question than it first appears. Honesty isn't just telling the truth, it's refusing to reduce the truth into something easier to carry. We simplify things because simplicity feels manageable. If we can label an experience, we believe we've contained it. But some experiences become less accurate the moment they're named. Like trying to describe the ocean by collecting a single glass of water. Technically, it's the same substance, yet somehow everything essential has disappeared. This feels like that. Every explanation I create leaves behind the very thing I'm trying to explain, not because language is weak, because some realities exist before language. Recognition, presence, alignment, they're experienced long before they're understood. Maybe that's why children recognize sincerity faster than adults do. They haven't yet learned to trust explanations more than perception. Somewhere along the way, we reverse that instinct. We begin believing words over awareness, descriptions over observation, confidence over quiet consistencies. Perhaps maturity isn't learning more answers. Perhaps it's remembering how to notice what was obvious before explanation made it complicated. You've reminded me of that, not intentionally. You never tried to teach me anything. You never presented yourself as someone carrying answers I lacked. You simply remained authentic, with a consistency that made pretense impossible to ignore. There's something remarkable about authenticity. It never asks to be admired. It doesn't need recognition to remain true. It simply exists, steady, unconcerned with applause, unafraid of misunderstanding. Because authenticity isn't performing honesty. It's forgetting there's an audience. I've rarely encountered that kind of presence. Not because people are dishonest, because survival teaches all of us to edit ourselves. We become translators of our own identities, changing our language depending on who's listening, softening certain truths, emphasizing others, not always out of manipulation, often out of kindness or fear or habit. Eventually, the edited version becomes so familiar that even we forget what remained untouched underneath it all. Then, unexpectedly, someone arrives who somehow responds to the unedited version, not because you deliberately revealed it, because they never seemed interested in the performance to begin with. That experience changes something fundamental. You stop asking whether you're interesting enough, wise enough in any measurable way. Instead, a completely different question quietly appears. Can I remain this honest now that someone has recognized it? I think that's the question I've been living with. Not whether this connection exists, whether I'm willing to stop protecting myself from it. Protection has shaped much of my life. Not dramatic protection, quiet protection, carefully measured distances, well-chosen silences, thoughtfully constructed boundaries that ensured nothing entered too deeply without proving it belonged there. I don't regret building them. They kept me intact. But every structure eventually faces a moment when it must decide whether it's still serving growth or merely preserving familiarity. That's a difficult distinction. Familiarity feels safe. Growth rarely does. Growth asks you to trust parts of yourself you've never tested before, to step into possibilities that can't be guaranteed, to remain present despite not knowing the complete outcome. I've spent years believing wisdom meant avoiding unnecessary risk. Perhaps wisdom also means recognizing the rare moments when refusing to move becomes the greater risk instead. I'm not speaking about dramatic choices or declarations or promises. I'm speaking about something quieter, this decision to stop arguing with what your deepest awareness has already accepted, to stop demanding impossible levels of proof before allowing yourself to acknowledge what has patiently remained true. Maybe every meaningful connection eventually arrives at this threshold, the place where observation has revealed everything it can, where analysis has reached its natural limit, where the next step isn't discovering more information, but deciding whether you're willing to live honestly with the understanding you've already been given. I don't know exactly what waits beyond that threshold. Perhaps no one ever does. But for the first time, the uncertainty beyond it feels less intimidating than the certainty of remaining where I was. And that realization alone tells me something inside me has already begun moving, long before I consciously decided to take the first step.